The storm rolled in long before the cadets landed. From the viewing deck aboard the orbital cruiser Galaxis Proving Grounds, the instructors had already watched the electric clouds roil and churn over Volt Cradle, a cursed zone known for its perpetual atmospheric instability. Even from orbit, the flashes of lightning looked unnatural, sharp, violet bolts with branching fingers that licked the ground like sentient tentacles. Thunderstorms here didn't just roar, they screamed. When the drop sequence began, 12 capsules ignited in synchronized descent, each carrying one cadet from a different species of the Galactic Coalition. It was the most dangerous of the elite trials, a final test reserved only for the most promising candidates. The mission was simple in theory: survive 72 planetary hours in Volt Cradle. No assistance, no reinforcements, no shelters provided. The instructors gave no warning that this particular trial would begin during a storm, but that was part of the design. Kai Moreno sat quietly inside his capsule as it burned through the upper atmosphere. The capsule shuddered violently under the turbulence, the harness biting into his chest with each jolt. His left hand was curled loosely around a narrow metal rod, no longer than a forearm. It was smooth and slightly bent, a scrap from an old antenna he'd modified. He stared at it not with worry but with calculation, already forming diagrams in his mind. The others had brought equipment: portable generators, drone scouts, collapsible shelters, heat fields, auto-mapping bots. Kai brought a backpack filled with rope, stripped copper wiring, metal clamps, a roll of insulation tape, 3 salvaged circuit chips, and that single rod. His capsule struck the surface with a bone-jarring thud. A cloud of reddish dust exploded outward, swallowed instantly by a sweeping gust of storm wind. The hatch hissed open. Static danced in the air like fireflies. Kai stepped out into chaos. The terrain was desolate. Cracked black soil veined with shimmering quartz and glowing filaments of energy that pulsed beneath the surface like slow lightning. Above, the sky was a churning sea of dark purple and gray, alive with distant flashes that flickered like blinking eyes. The wind carried a strange metallic scent. Every few seconds, a bolt would strike the ground somewhere far off, and the shockwave would tremble beneath Kai's boots. To the east, another capsule had landed. A feathered alien cadet named Cirella emerged, her suit glowing with energy dispersal panels. Her drone followed behind, scanning the terrain in a lazy circle. She looked around in confusion, then locked eyes with Kai, who simply nodded once before turning to examine the rise behind him. He didn't waste time talking. Instructors observed from orbit, taking notes. The cadets fanned out across the terrain, each heading in a different direction, trying to find high ground or cave formations. Kai chose the ridge, not because it offered protection, but because it would be exposed. He needed altitude, and he needed metal, real metal. The storm wasn't just a threat, it was an opportunity. Hours passed, the wind worsened. Temperatures dropped below freezing as dusk approached. Kai reached the top of the ridge and dropped his pack, pulling out the antenna rod and holding it upright against the wind. He didn't plant it yet. He just watched. The sky had patterns, pulses. There was rhythm to the lightning, though most would never see it. Kai had grown up in New Boston, Earth's reconstructed coastal city known for its tempest seasons. By the age of 10, he could tell from the color of a cloud how far away the storm's center was. By 12, he could tell where lightning would strike within a 15-meter radius. His father had called it a gift. His mother had called it suicidal curiosity. The academy called it tactical environmental adaptation. The ridge was barren, but beneath the thin soil, Kai found fragments of reinforced steel, remains of old testing structures long abandoned by previous trial architects. He dug for them with his bare hands, scraping until his knuckles bled, then used his belt to wedge out a longer piece. He inspected it, wiped the rust, and smiled. It would conduct beautifully. Far below the ridge, panic had begun. The feathered cadet's drone had dropped from the sky, its power core fried by a high atmospheric burst. Two other cadets were shouting into comms that no longer worked. An insectoid recruit was trying to dig into a rock formation using his reinforced mandibles. Another, a crystalline female from Varus 9, sat in complete stillness, her species' instinctive response to overwhelming stimuli. Kai saw all of it from above, just silhouettes in the fading light, framed by flashes of violet and arcs of electric energy snaking across the ground. He unpacked his wire, unwound it carefully, and began shaping it into a spiral around the steel fragment. He connected the copper to a flattened circuit chip and embedded the assembly in a shallow trench he carved into the ridge's center. Then he placed the rod upright, reinforced it with stones, and stepped back. He wasn't building shelter, he was building a lightning rod. Kai's logic was simple. The storm could not be fought, so it must be used. Every other cadet focused on shielding themselves, digging, hiding, or attempting to escape the energy. But what if the energy could be captured, redirected, stored? He wrapped a section of wire around his spare battery core, salvaged from an old drone, modified to withstand short bursts of high voltage. It was the size of his palm, light, and insulated in an old carbon poly case he had sealed himself back at the academy. Now it sat beneath his rod, waiting, hoping, listening. Night came swiftly in Volt Cradle. The first bolt struck less than an hour after he finished his setup. It hit a nearby outcropping, the sound like a cannon cracking open the sky. The flash was so bright that for a moment the world became negative. Black sky, white ground, all reversed. Kai didn't flinch. He adjusted the position of his rod, moved the wiring slightly, and waited again. Then it came. The second bolt found the tip of the rod. It struck with a hiss and a scream, like metal tearing open the fabric of sound. Sparks flew. Kai dropped to his knees instinctively, though he had no fear. The trench glowed. His battery hummed. For a second, everything lit up around him. The cave entrance, the stones, even the edges of his fingers. And then silence. The storm receded, momentarily sated. Kai sat still, breathing deeply. He reached for the battery, warm, alive, not full, but pulsing. He had done it. Below the ridge, cadets huddled in darkness and cold. Tech had failed. Hope was draining. Yet atop the hill, one human sat beside a humming power cell and a stick in the ground, and smiled into the wind. The instructors watching from orbit made a note in his file. Human Cadet, Kai Moreno. Status, active. Assessment, strategically adaptive under extreme conditions. Early behavioral markers, exploratory rather than defensive. Watch closely. And so the trial began. Kai stood at the mouth of the shallow cave as the second wave of the storm approached. He had spent the night curled near the warmest corner, his back pressed to the stone, the modified battery wrapped tightly in cloth at his side. Now the early light filtered in, pale and yellowish, painting the jagged interior of the cave with shifting shadows. He stepped out just enough to feel the breeze and raised his hand to test the static in the air. His fingertips tingled. The next cycle would begin soon. The wind no longer howled. It hissed. It moved with purpose, snaking across the cracked earth and dragging fine grains of black dust in long spirals. Kai narrowed his eyes as he scanned the lower slopes. Several camps had appeared overnight, makeshift shelters built from tarp-like materials, fractured canopies, and parts salvaged from ruined capsules. But they were not organized. He could tell by the scattered angles and uneven footprints that desperation had already taken root. He spotted the crystalline cadet near the cliff base. She was crouched low, her body posture motionless, refracting the weak light through her angular limbs like glass. To her right, an avian cadet with dark red feathers attempted to reboot a collapsed signal flare, repeatedly tapping at a pad that no longer responded. Beyond him, a trio of insectoid siblings, thin, twitchy, high-strung creatures, were digging a shallow pit with their multi-jointed limbs, tossing soil aside with frantic movements. The energy field meant to protect them from high-voltage surges had vanished sometime during the night. Now their translucent wings fluttered in the cold air, more from fear than function. Kai descended the ridge in silence, his steps practiced and deliberate. He wasn't going to offer help, not yet. He had learned early in his life that advice offered too soon or too freely often bred resentment. Most species in the coalition were proud. Some had been taught since birth that humans were barely above survival animals, clever perhaps, but unrefined and instinct-driven. He would let the trial prove otherwise. When he reached the edge of the slope, he crouched near a discarded hunk of machinery, a fractured drone casing left behind by one of the cadets. He pried it open with the edge of a rusted support rod and inspected the inner matrix. Melted. Useless. The pulse from the night storm had fried everything with an unprotected board. He pulled out what copper he could and wound it around his wrist for later. A scream cracked across the plateau. He turned sharply, scanning for the source. To the west, one of the insectoid cadets collapsed. His body convulsed, one limb twitching violently. Sparks danced across his carapace, residual charge from a ground bolt that had struck too close. His sibling lunged toward him but pulled back when a second surge licked across the stone, narrowly missing both. Kai sprinted toward them, the copper slipping from his wrist as he moved. He reached the injured cadet in seconds. The creature's chitin plates were cracked, and one antenna had been burned off completely. He was breathing. Shallow. Rapid. Kai dropped to one knee, reached into his pack, and pulled out a strip of salvaged insulation. He wrapped it gently around the most exposed section of the cadet's upper thorax. It wasn't a full medical solution, but it would reduce further discharge. The sibling watched him with wide, unblinking eyes. She made a short clicking noise, something between confusion and suspicion. "He'll live," Kai said calmly, checking the pulse-like vibrations along the cadet's side. "But he needs shade and grounding." The sibling said nothing, but she backed away slightly and began adjusting the tarp over their trench. Another cadet, this one a feline-like warrior with black stripes, approached cautiously and stared down at the human. "You touch him without permission?" the feline asked, his tone sharp. Kai stood and brushed the dirt from his knees. "He was dying." "I stopped him from dying." "You think that makes you a hero?" "No," Kai replied and turned away. "It makes me someone who understands how electricity moves." He climbed back toward the ridge. He could feel eyes on him, watching, judging, weighing. He didn't care. Time was short. By midday, the clouds began to darken again. The quiet tension across the camp tightened like a rope pulled taut. Those who still had functioning drones sent them up for one final scan. But the interference in the upper atmosphere had worsened. Even the satellites overhead were flickering, their feeds distorted and erratic. Kai finished reinforcing his trench, deepening the angle of the rod and adjusting the copper coil around his second battery. He had built a second capacitor, cruder than the first, but serviceable. With two sources of stored power, he could attempt something riskier, possibly even create radiant heating within the cave or jumpstart one of the dead comms nodes. He wasn't here just to survive. He was beginning to build. Down below, the mood soured. Two cadets were arguing loudly over a failed ration heater, their voices distorted by their native frequencies but clearly hostile. A reptilian officer attempted to intervene but was pushed aside. A scuffle broke out. No punches, just snarls, shouting, accusations. Fear was becoming anger. Kai watched briefly, then shook his head. He turned back to his wiring. The sky flashed. The first bolt of the second storm struck less than a kilometer away. The energy crawled across the ground, leaving glowing scars in the rock. It was followed by another, closer, louder. The impact thudded through the cave walls. Kai could feel it in his sternum. Then came the third, right on his rod. The explosion of light was nearly blinding. The copper spirals ignited like veins of fire. The battery pack flared, then hissed, stabilizing. Kai dropped to one knee, shielding his eyes. The trench kicked up a spray of dust and static. He waited for silence. It came in a heartbeat. His pack was warm. The charge had taken. Behind him, a cadet had climbed the ridge. She was silent, slender, and covered in scale armor that shimmered faintly in the pale light. She said nothing, simply stood at the edge and stared at his rod, her eyes wide with disbelief. He didn't speak. He simply opened the cloth wrap to show the now glowing battery and the functional heating coil inside the cave. The cadet stepped forward. "You built this," she said in a halting accent. He nodded once. Will you teach me?" Kai paused. Then he offered her the second coil. "Wrap this around your grounding stake. Then stay low. Do not touch the rod." The cadet took it without hesitation. Below, others had begun to notice. The ridge, once dismissed as a foolish choice, now looked like a source of power. And power, in Volt Cradle, was survival. Kai returned to his trench and began sketching something new in the dirt. He had 3 more hours before the next strike, and he intended to be ready. The wind shifted by early afternoon. It no longer hissed through the stone formations, but hummed, a deep, droning vibration that settled into the bones like a warning drum. Kai sat crouched beside his trench, watching dust spiral upward in tight coils, drawn not by wind, but by the rising static potential in the air. The storm was preparing to speak again, and this time he would be ready to listen more closely. The battery pack from the morning's strike was still warm against the wall of the cave. He had carefully reinforced its casing with additional insulation, wrapping it in layers of carbon fiber mesh stripped from a damaged drone shell. Though the charge was not stable enough for extended use, he had managed to power a heating coil and a field light for short bursts. The cave no longer felt like shelter by accident. It was becoming something designed. Just outside the cave entrance, a new figure approached. She moved slowly, dragging a long rod behind her with both hands. It was the same cadet who had stood silently at the ridge earlier, a scaled woman from the aquatic colonies of Nyari Prime. Her translucent armor shimmered in the dim light, subtly refracting the haze. She kept her head low, her gill slits fluttering slightly in the dry air. Kai met her halfway, eyeing the rod she carried. "I wrapped it," she said, lifting it carefully. "Just like you showed me. But the grounding won't stay." Kai took the rod from her hands, turned it slowly, then pointed to the notch near the base. "It's fractured here," he said. "You'll need to drive it deeper, and angle it toward the rock shelf." She blinked once in understanding, then nodded. "Do you have more tape?" He handed her the final strip of his copper weave, carefully cut earlier that morning. "This is all I can spare," he said. "Make it count." She turned without hesitation and began descending the ridge. Kai watched her go, noting the confident pace in her steps. She had learned quickly, and others would soon follow. Kai returned to his setup and made minor adjustments to the secondary rod he had built near the mouth of the cave. He shifted the coil tighter, rearranged the grounding stones, and inserted a third wire to route excess energy into the wall where he had embedded a primitive capacitor cluster. The cluster was little more than fused wiring embedded in resin, but if the next bolt struck close enough, it would siphon residual charge that otherwise would be lost. As the hours passed, more cadets ventured up the slope. The first was a feline cadet named Rosk, tall and sinewy, with black stripes that flickered like warning patterns when he moved. He approached without hostility, his hands empty, but his eyes narrowed in suspicion. He stopped a few paces away from Kai, examining the rods, the wiring, the coils, and the faint light emanating from the cave. "You're controlling it," Rosk said, his voice low and almost begrudging. "The sky. You're catching it." "No one controls lightning," Kai replied calmly, "but it speaks in a language I understand." Rosk tilted his head, considering the answer. "You're not the strongest, not the fastest. So why does the storm favor you? Kai didn't answer right away. Instead, he picked up a small stone and dropped it near one of the grounding wires. The metal sparked faintly, and a pulse of energy flickered along the cable. Rosk flinched. The storm doesn't favor anyone, Kai said finally, but it rewards those who listen. The feline cadet gave a quiet grunt and turned away, vanishing back into the haze. Minutes later, two others appeared, one of the insectoid siblings and a crystalline male with fractured limbs from earlier strikes. Neither spoke, but both lingered near the edge of the ridge, watching. Kai allowed them to stay. By sunset, 6 cadets had set up basic ground wires around the upper slope. Only 3 had working rods. The others had tried to fashion conductive structures from scrap, using armor plates, drone limbs, even parts of fractured helmets. Some of it would work, some of it wouldn't. Kai helped where he could, adjusting angles, wrapping joints, adding stabilizers using rock wedges and bundled rope. He didn't ask for anything in return. Every working rod reduced the chance of a strike hitting somewhere unintended. The air grew heavy again, thick, the kind of pressure that made lungs feel shallow and silence feel loaded. Distant booms rolled across the sky. The storm had returned. The first bolt hit far to the east. A high shriek followed, a voice, someone shouting, but no one moved from the ridge. Seconds later, another strike, this time closer, just beyond the next valley. The cadets crouched low near their grounding rods, eyes wide, hands gripped on rock. Kai didn't move from his trench. He sat cross-legged beside the coil, one hand resting near the capacitor bank. Then, without warning, the ridge lit up. Lightning arced down like a blade from the heavens, splitting the sky with brutal force. It struck Kai's rod directly, the impact sending dust and fire in all directions. The copper screamed with heat. The trench flared, glowing blue-white for a heartbeat. Kai ducked and shielded his face with one arm as sparks rained around him. When the light faded, the capacitor bank buzzed like a living thing. He reached out, carefully touched the casing, hot but not molten. The insulation had held. Energy pulsed beneath the surface, jumping along the wire coils in rhythmic pulses. He grinned. It had worked better than expected. A second strike hit further down the slope. One of the cadets who had mimicked Kai's design let out a cry, not of pain, but awe. Her rod had caught the charge, and her coil had survived. The others began to murmur, whispering in low tones across species and dialects. The storm raged through the night, delivering strike after strike across the surrounding plateaus. But the ridge, once feared, now glowed faintly with proof that the impossible could be shaped, not with force, but with understanding. By dawn, Kai had powered a second field light. He placed it at the edge of the cave, illuminating the path for those who might climb the ridge again. He brewed tea using the heat coil and poured it into a dented metal cup he'd salvaged on day 1. It tasted metallic, bitter, and perfect. He sat alone at the mouth of his cave, sipping slowly, as the wind began to calm. When the others awoke, they would see the light on the ridge, and they would remember who lit it. The wind that greeted the dawn was different. It was no longer charged with invisible teeth or thick with the scent of ozone. It had softened, quieted, as if the storm had retreated to observe what had unfolded below. Kai stepped from his cave into the amber light of early morning, his boots grinding softly against the gravel. The clouds still loomed overhead, dark and heavy, but they were now slow-moving, suspended like witnesses over the landscape they had once threatened to tear apart. The capacitor banks lining the inside wall of the cave pulsed gently, their casing warm and silent. He had managed to wire 3 separate rods into a central energy transfer system during the night's final surge. Each rod had captured enough charge to power not just heat, but light, communication signals, and perhaps, if stabilized correctly, even basic shielding for other cadets. He had not built this system to hoard. That had never been his intention. He built to endure, and when endurance overflowed, he shared. A soft cough drew his attention. At the edge of the cave stood the crystalline cadet, the one whose limbs had been partially fractured by ground surges on the first day. He no longer limped. He had replaced a splintered forearm with a makeshift brace tied from flexible tubing and hardened sap. His face, more angular than expressive, reflected the light in fragments as he lifted a small pack in offering. Kai took the pack, opened it carefully, and found preserved nutrient strips, the kind issued in coalition emergency rations. He looked at the cadet, who said nothing but nodded once, then turned and descended the ridge again. Kai took one strip and left the rest inside the cave. Later that morning, a group of 3 cadets arrived together. Rosk the feline, the scaled woman from Niari Prime, and the youngest of the insectoid siblings, whose mandibles twitched nervously with each step. They said nothing at first, only stood in silence while Kai tended to the trench and adjusted the coils near the far rod. Eventually, Rosk stepped forward and gestured toward the main battery unit. "How do you keep it from burning through?" he asked. Kai straightened and wiped his hands on the side of his trousers. "You give the energy somewhere to go," he replied. "Insulate, direct, divide it if needed." The scaled woman tilted her head. "And if it fractures the storage core?" "Then you rebuild," Kai said simply. "Smaller loads. More patience." Rosk gave a short growl of agreement and crouched near the trench. The others followed his lead. For the next hour they asked questions, not the kind born of curiosity, but of necessity. Questions about wire length, grounding angles, voltage bleed, and resistance under wet conditions. Kai answered each one calmly, methodically. He showed them where to brace the rods, where to layer stone instead of soil, and how to track the electric scent in the air before the sky gave warning. The insectoid cadet stayed longest, carefully drawing diagrams in the dust with a claw, copying every symbol Kai scratched out. At one point, Kai noticed her trembling hands and handed her a folded wrap of dry leaf used to steady wires. She took it silently and continued her notes. By midday, Kai had started guiding them in constructing additional rods along the slope. The materials were crude, pieces of old gear, broken hulls, scraps of abandoned tech, but the designs worked. He tested each one by hand, checking for resistance and loose coils, making small corrections. As the structures rose, the ridge began to transform. No longer just a shelter or an observation point, it was becoming a grid, an intentional layout of conductors and circuits embedded in stone. Other cadets began to drift in. Some stood at the perimeter, watching with unreadable expressions. A few approached and asked for help. One, a bulky amphibious warrior from the Sulon marsh worlds, tried to bargain with food rations in exchange for a capacitor. Kai refused the trade, but offered guidance instead. "Build your own," Kai told him, pointing toward the spare copper bundle near the wall. "I'll show you how." At first, the cadet bristled. His kind did not often receive instructions from humans. But after a long pause, he dropped the ration pack and followed Kai into the dust. Within an hour, he had shaped his first coil. Even those who had once dismissed him now came forward, not with deference, but with recognition. Kai noticed the change in their posture, the way they stepped toward him instead of circling from afar, the way they waited for his confirmation after placing a rod instead of declaring it finished. He did not raise his voice. He did not command. He taught, quietly, precisely, with hands that worked faster than his words and eyes that saw connections others missed. In the late afternoon, a soft signal blinked to life on the far edge of the ridge, a signal beacon, previously thought to be unsalvageable. One of the cadets had managed to power it using the capacitor network they built. It glowed red for a moment, then green. A ripple of reaction swept across the ridge. A few cadets looked to the sky, wondering if the instructors were watching. Kai didn't look up. He focused on the solder point beneath the beacon's casing, tightening the wire with pliers fashioned from bent carbon struts. When he finally rose and stepped back, the beacon remained steady, fully functional. A murmur passed among the cadets. Not loud, not reverent, just a soft acknowledgement of a moment none had expected. As dusk settled once again, casting the ridge in soft lavender hues beneath the storm-drenched sky, Kai returned to his cave. The fire he had coaxed from the converted coil crackled softly. The heating stone pulsed with low warmth. He placed another metal cup near the coil, poured water from his reserve, and added crushed root for flavor. His muscles ached. His knuckles were raw. But his work was not yet done. He set a new schematic on the cave wall using chalk from the ridge, a plan for a multi-node storage system using branch coils. It would allow for broader energy distribution, reducing the chance of overload during simultaneous strikes. If the storm returned in full force, this grid might not only survive, it might expand. As he stared at the chalk lines, a quiet voice came from the entrance. "Why do you do this?" the scaled woman asked. "You don't owe us anything." Kai didn't turn around. He added another line to the schematic, circling it twice. "Because storms are meant to pass," he said, "but what we build in them can stay." She remained silent for a moment, then stepped forward, setting a bundle of fresh foraged roots beside the heating stone. Without another word, she left. Kai sat down, poured another cup of tea, and watched the sky begin to flicker again, this time not with threat, but with rhythm. He knew the storm would come again, and he knew the ridge was ready. The final night fell without thunder. The storm, like a great beast that had raged and clawed for dominance, now loomed quiet above the horizon. The air still crackled faintly, but the fury had passed. The clouds hovered low and bruised, swollen with the remnants of energy, but no longer violent. Instead, there was a hush over Volt Cradle, a silence more intense than the thunder had ever been. It was the kind of silence that came only after something had been fundamentally changed. Kai stood on the highest point of the ridge, near the primary lightning rod, his arms crossed against the cool wind. His coat, patched with burn holes and frayed at the sleeves, fluttered softly. Below him, the slope he had once climbed alone was now marked by rods, grounding wires, signal nodes, and scattered shelters. The ridge had become a functioning microgrid, pulsing gently with stored charge, its energy harnessed through nothing but will, adaptation, and human persistence. Around the perimeter, cadets stirred in hushed movements. No arguments echoed now, no drones whirred, no one called out for help. Instead, quiet work was done, coils checked, rods reinforced, firestones sparked for warmth. Every cadet still standing had built something, and every one of them had learned something from the human whose method had become the blueprint for survival. Shortly before dawn, a low-frequency pulse rolled across the land. It came not from the sky, but from orbit, an extraction signal. The trial was over. The sound reached the ridge like a distant chime, subtle and unmistakable. Some cadets stopped their tasks and looked skyward. Others remained seated, staring at their hands or tools, uncertain how to feel now that the end had arrived. Kai turned slowly, his eyes scanning the horizon. Across the basin, 3 extraction vessels had entered atmosphere, trailing fire as their re-entry shields burned against the thinning clouds. The thunderstorm that had once owned the skies now parted for them, as if offering respect. The vessels slowed, anti-grav plates glowing blue beneath them, and settled into the clearing at the base of the ridge. The lead ramp descended first, its sides folding open in ceremonial fashion. A group of instructors emerged, all wearing the dark robes and metallic insignia of the Coalition's Evaluation Bureau. Among them was a towering figure, Admiral Karev. His cybernetic spine gleamed with crimson circuitry, and his mechanical eye scanned the ridge with clinical precision. Kai descended the slope alone. He moved slowly, not out of weakness, but out of a deliberate calm. Each step was measured, grounded. When he reached the base, he stopped just beyond the ramp, his eyes meeting the Admiral's without flinching. Admiral Karev stepped forward. "State your name, cadet," the Admiral said, his voice like gravel crushed beneath steel. "Kai Moreno," he replied, his tone steady. "Earth Division, Human Sector." The Admiral glanced past him toward the ridge, where cadets had begun gathering near the edge, some watching, some descending behind him. "You survived," Karev said. "And from what we observed, you did more than that." Kai said nothing. "You built an energy capture grid in an active storm basin. You powered signaling equipment, heated shelters, distributed knowledge to multiple species, and prevented at least 4 cadet fatalities." The Admiral's voice did not shift in tone, but something in his posture did. "Why?" Kai considered the question, then answered simply, "Because I had the tools. And I had the time. And nothing was stopping me." Admiral Karev stared at him for a long moment. His mechanical eye blinked once, an unnatural shutter-like motion. Then he nodded once, almost imperceptibly. "You were expected to break," the Admiral said. "This environment was designed to break even the best. Do you know how many cadets made it to extraction in the last 10 years of this trial?" Kai shook his head. "None." Silence settled between them. Admiral Karev turned to his officers. "Prepare to catalog the cadets' materials for review. I want a full debrief of every power node, every design." The officers nodded and moved toward the ridge, flanked by drones. Kai stepped aside and watched them pass, offering a short nod to the crystalline cadet as he went by. The cadet gave a subtle gesture of acknowledgement in return. Within the hour, all surviving cadets had been gathered at the landing site. Medical checks were performed, data logs were extracted from suits and devices, and ration records were compiled. The instructors moved among the group, occasionally pausing to examine a design or ask a technical question. Each time Kai was approached, he answered with clarity, concise, unemotional, factual. By mid-morning, all cadets were aboard the extraction vessels. Inside the primary vessel's debriefing chamber, Kai stood alone before a long, curved table. The Admiral sat at the center, flanked by 2 ranking officers and a silent observer whose eyes were hidden behind a thin veil of shimmering data glass. "You were not expected to lead," the officer to the Admiral's left said. "You ranked 32nd in tactical command aptitude prior to this trial." "I'm aware," Kai replied. "You've never taken a leadership seminar," the second officer noted. "No." "You weren't selected for strategic innovation training either." "No." The Admiral leaned forward. "And yet, others followed you." Not because of orders, but because of results, Kai didn't respond. He didn't need to. The Admiral tapped his metallic finger against the table. "What you built on that ridge, what you taught, has already altered the evaluation criteria for this trial. This will be reflected in the formal records." Kai blinked once. "Understood." The Admiral rose. "You are no longer a cadet. As of this moment, you are promoted to Provisional Officer and reassigned to the Adaptive Engineering Task Division. You will report to Site Theta within 72 hours. Kai stood straighter. "Acknowledged, Admiral." The meeting ended without applause. No praise, no handshakes, only the cold clarity of acknowledgement. As he left the chamber, Kai walked past the viewport lining the corridor. He paused briefly, staring down at the landscape of Volt Cradle below. The ridges, the scars, the blackened ground where lightning had carved its name into stone. In the distance, the ridge still stood, faint glimmers of light pulsing from the rods left behind. He didn't feel pride. He felt completion. Back on the transport deck, some cadets nodded as he passed. Others said nothing but shifted slightly in respect. Rosk gave him a brief salute. The scaled woman offered him a wrapped bundle of copper wire, a token, not of need, but of gratitude. Kai tucked it into his coat pocket without a word. Hours later, when the vessel broke orbit, the storm basin below remained quiet. No more thunder, no more flashes, just silence and the slow rise of clouds parting beneath the ship. and at the center of the ridge, still anchored in the stone, one rod remained upright, burned, blackened, but standing. A monument to adaptation, to knowledge, to the human who had come without armor or weapons and left behind a network of power and light. The Coalition files would mark the trial as unprecedented success under non-standard methodology. The cadets would remember it as the place where survival was redefined, and Kai would carry its rhythm, its storm beat, into every frontier he faced after.